A unified security platform that combines multiple security solutions into one correlated management plane, offering advanced protection for cloud-native resources. So again, my translation, it's not a single tool. It's the culmination of multiple security products all working together. And so my holistic definition is it's a comprehensive platform that brings together various security tools under one roof, allowing them to work in harmony, provide complete protection for our cloud-native environments. Okay, so Gartner has their version. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, just some good info for you. They kind of split it into two, like you have data plane operations and control plane. Within data plane, you're really concerned about code that you're writing and that you're developing, where you're like shipping it, your infrastructure is code, your actual runtime. So that's all the data plane. And then control plane is looking at the security of your cloud environment itself, security of your Kubernetes, your identities, and things like that. The way I like to lay it out is like this. This is the basics of a CNAPP. Okay, so first, inventory. You can't really protect your cloud native environments unless you have inventory. So it starts all with that. That's kind of a given. And then the major ones here are CSPM, DSPM, and I'll explain these here in a second. Cloud infrastructure entitlement management, or as it's soon going to be called, identity security posture management. Cloud workload protection. There's ASPM or AppSec, application security or app code security. And then there's some other posture management tools as well. And I'll go into detail about what these are. And again, how can you guys look for these? I'm not, again, for those coming in, I'm not talking vendors today. That's not the goal here. The goal is to instruct and educate on if you're being instructed to use these vendors, or you're being instructed to find a CNAPP, or someone's pitching you a CNAPP, how can you spot the BS? How can you understand what's really important, what's not? That's the goal here. And I'll explain each of these core components. But in my opinion, CNAPP is useless unless we can do something. What can we detect? What can we respond to? For a long time, we've had tools telling us here's everything wrong with your environment, here's everything going on in your workloads. Well, what do I do with that? For a long time, we've had that. So the goal of a modern CNAPP is to say, here's what we know, and then here's what we can do. So CDR, cloud detection and response, should always be a goal of any tool that you use. So you may be thinking, this doesn't really sound new. It's not. Do you need me to pause real quick?
No.
Okay. This doesn't sound new. It's not. And it also doesn't really sound unique. Trust me, I know. Every company says they have a CNAPP. The bar at the bottom is to represent where I normally, in an executive presentation, would talk about vendors. Again, I'm not doing that today. Just letting you know there's a ton of people in this space. How can you spot the BS? How can you find what really matters to you guys and your business? Again, as practitioners, trying to enable you to find what's the right tool for your business if you're being tasked to do so. So first, I want to kind of step back and where did CNAPP come from? Like, what's the evolution here? So there were really two camps. One was posture management, and the other was runtime security. Posture management was all about the agentless craze. 2017, 2018, 2019, everyone was, well, we're agentless. Oh, we're agentless this, agentless that. Which was good. We needed that. It was great. It served its purpose, and it's still serving a purpose. But really what that gave us was full inventory of our cloud environment. And so we also started to introduce identity posture. So looking at our identities, so we're not only are we looking at our cloud resources, but also the identities within those cloud resources. And then more recently, about 2021, we started the introduction of data security posture management and the key insights you might get from looking at your data to help prioritize and understand like what's our most critical risks. So that's posture management, and that's very simply is we're just going to look at how everything's configured and try to spot issues. We're not even caring about runtime. We're just trying to spot issues as configured. Runtime defense, this was the agent-based approach. Workload agents, I'm going to make a quick distinction. This is not necessarily EDR, endpoint detection and response. This is not, okay, I'll violate my rule. I'll talk vendors for 1 second. This is not CrowdStrike or Defender or Silence or all those things. EDR is a different beast, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But the workload agents were meant for cloud workloads, cloud native workloads, okay? Which is a very different threat than a user workstation that might require EDR, XDR, or MDR, or whatever those acronyms are. This is where you're going to get like Kubernetes and containers supports. Also bleeding into application and code security. So we're looking at what's going on in our runtime and how do we detect, stop threats and things like that. And along the way, we kind of realized we need both. to get a holistic picture of our cloud native security. We really need both. And so then that kind of merges into this modern CNAPP, which is the intersection of posture and runtime. The goal here is to make all of our findings contextually aware, understand what are our response capabilities, and then also how do we focus our response and remediation efforts properly. Because again, for a long time, we've been told, here's everything wrong with your cloud. Here's everything wrong with your IAM configurations. Here's everything wrong with your S3 bucket configuration. We've been told that for a long time, but what do we fix, and then which ones do we fix first? And so the modern CNAPP kind of brings all of those together. So that's kind of where we were and where we're moving to. And again, all of this has a fundamental output of what do we respond to, cloud detection and response. So I mentioned there were like 6 or 7 different like core components, I would say, that make up what a CNAPP could be. These are the 4 that I think are absolute necessities, table stakes if you're looking at a CNAPP. And again, this is generalities. There may be instances where one might be less important than the other, but for a broad spectrum, these are what I think you should be looking at in for a successful CNAPP implementation, and then what might differentiate CNAPP other providers from one another. So again, the definition of CNAPPs on the left, intersection of posture and runtime, contextually aware, we'll talk about that. The 4 components, I'm going to talk about them individually, and then I'll talk about them holistically. So individually, CSPM, simple agentless onboarding, full account visibility. We want to look at our static configurations of our cloud assets. There's a ton more to CSPM, but that's kind of the basics. A big one that I like to add in there, the streaming log changes, streaming audit log. So if you AWS, you got your audit log, or what do they call it? I forget what they call it. Azure, they call it the audit log. But you're watching that for specific changes that are being made, and you can respond faster. So that's a key part to more of that real-time, quote-unquote, CSPM. But that's really what a cloud security posture management tool should do on its own. It should be able to give you full inventory and look at all of your configurations within your cloud. And be able to spot big issues, critical issues that on their own, hey, we need to take care of. But how does that feed into everything else? Again, glad you asked, we'll talk about that. DSPM, very similar, asset discovery, inventory. We need to be able to sample our data. So we got to find where our data is and sample it. What is it? Is it PII, HI, financial information, confidential information, research data, whatever? How do we find it, classify it, and then continuously find and classify, and then use those findings to provide risk assessments and prioritization for our business? A lot of companies that I talk to, data exposure is their #1 word. Where I don't care if a finding is vulnerable to the to this CVE, but I do care if it's vulnerable to the CVE, or at least it's higher importance if it's also got some type of data exposure. So that's usually a key criteria that people are looking for. So good DSPM, that's really basic, but there's a whole lot more that you can go into. But just for the purpose of the CNAPP, this is what it should be. Key insights for data. Cloud infrastructure entitlement management, more broadly, as it will be known, it's a new thing that I bet my paycheck within the next 2 years it will be called ISPM, Identity Security Posture Management. So ISPM would kind of roll up, identity governance, cloud infrastructure entitlement management, RBAC roles and permissions, all that would kind of roll up under. Yes, yeah, I call it KIM instead of using the S sound, so because that's a problem. So yeah, ISPM just makes more sense in my opinion. But here what we're doing is we're looking for human, non-human identities. Again, inventory. You can kind of see a theme here. Looking for inventory. Continuous discovery. Are we connecting to our IDPs to understand who are these users? Are they, if they're human? And then we want to map all of those users and the roles and their permissions across all of our different clouds and understand our entire cloud estate. Who's who and what are they doing? What do they have access to? And again, like with the others, there's so much more that it should do. Is it? It's red now. Okay, good. It went back to green. Just a second. There's so much more that an identity tool should do, but one big one in the context of CNAPP is looking for over-provisioned status. So for example, can we see like, hey, this app service account has more permissions than it actually ends up using in your cloud estate. Well, there's a bigger blast radius if it's potentially compromised. So from an identity perspective, that's basically what we should be doing. Again, from CNAPP, there's so much more that it should and can do, but in a CNAPP conversation, these are kind of like the basics, the table stakes. Cloud workload protection, again, this is not EDR. The way I like to describe it to executives, because it paints a pretty picture in crayon, is EDR really should be for user at keyboard. EDR should be for the workstation where you have to assume that user is actively trying to destroy that computer and destroy your business, right? So the threats there are just so much different than a threat on a cloud workload. Cloud workloads would be things that have like predefined actions. It's a web server, you interact over a network, or it's a container, or it's a serverless function, has a predefined action and a predefined output. That's really what cloud workloads are, and those threats are just different than user at keyboard threats. So that's why I make the distinction. This is not EDR. They have some overlap, and you may even see some vendors that are traditionally EDR. Again, this is not a vendor talk, but everybody in the crowd should understand who I'm talking about. They are EDR, and they say they also have cloud workload protection, and they kind of do, so there's a little bit of overlap. But from a cloud workload perspective, it needs to be super, super lightweight. That automatically qualifies out most EDR. Yeah?
Just a question. Where does PAM, that privileged access management, where does that fit in under the...
I mean, you could qualify it under identity security posture management. So PAM and PIM are going to be part of your broader like identity governance program, which can roll up under ISPM, but the focus of all of these tools is not to be our cloud security tool, our identity security governance program, our data security program. There are some vendors who have that program approach and can do it pretty well. But for a CNAPP, we don't need most of the holistic program approach. So yeah, PIM and PAM would be part of your like program approach. Yeah, so those would hook into things like, think like SailPoint. SailPoint's like an idea.
Yeah, I'm just saying, SailPoint, you can customize it to something like Okta, jump log in,
Yeah, so PIM and PAM, those are part of a broader, I use the word program, but that's the best way to describe it, initiative of usually the C-suite and directors. So not excluded from here, but I wouldn't call it a core, like if you don't have this low, then you're going to fail as a CNAPP. In my opinion, you're going to be fine without it. Workload protection, again, lightweight, so that qualifies out most EDR solutions. That's why I make that distinction. System level visibility, we want to know everything that's going on in that system. TCP calls, file opens, everything. So Linux kernel usually, Linux is the primary target for cloud workload protection since most cloud workloads are Linux. Windows does now have support for eBPF. CrowdStrike is actually moving into that, which is good because it'll be much faster. But anyway, that's not the point of this conversation. In-memory cataloging, this is huge. So what's actually going on in memory? Looking at what binaries, libraries is actually being loaded into memory, because that provides some key context. Kubernetes support, container support, this is where we want that. And then ultimately, cloud workload protection is usually where CDR responses come to, because they're going to use that agent to actually do something. Close that network connection, delete a file, whatever. That's the CDR is going to leverage the CWPP component. So all of those individually, good products, and they probably are products you've probably heard of if you were to buy them off the shelf. But the problem is they're not talking to one another and informing one another of their findings. So the point of a CNAPP is to bring them all in under one roof and understand that your CSPM findings on their own might not be that important. Or how do I rank the importance of a CSPM finding? Let's say the CSPM provider says, oh, this is critical. And a CWPP says, oh, this is critical. And the identity says, this is critical. Well, how do we say, well, of all the criticals, which ones are critical 1, critical 2, critical 3, critical 4? We don't know. Unless all of them are analyzed together in the context of the whole cloud estate. So that's what I mean by full context. They all have to roll up under the CNAPP platform and inform one another of what's actually going on. I'm going to give you some examples, a good example here. Let's say your CSPM provider, maybe it's one tool, or maybe you have 4 different tools. Your CSPM provider says, hey, you've got this cloud workload, and the network interface has any. Okay, so it's open to the internet. Okay, what do you do? Is it supposed to? We don't know. Unless I actually go track down that owner, and that's usually the response is you get a finding, you get an alert in Slack or Jira ticket or Snow, and you go, oh crap, I gotta go find the owner of that machine if it's even tagged properly, which most of the time it's probably not. And hey, is it supposed to be open to the internet? Yes. Okay, well now I just wasted much more time. Your identity security posture management may show like, hey, that workload that's open to the internet has this role attached to it. Okay, is it supposed to have that role with those permissions? I don't know. I gotta go find that person and talk to them. Like, what is this role supposed to be doing? Your workload protection may be able to tell you, or it should be able to tell you, here's what's running in memory, and that binary has a vulnerability on it. Okay, that's important. We probably need to fix that. But is it really a problem? Is it exploitable? Part of being exploitable might need to be, is it reachable from the internet? So is it really important? I don't know. And DSPM provides a huge enrichment opportunity to say, hey, this data bucket has private information. Let's just go with that. All of those findings are 4 separate responses that 4 different teams likely will have to make. Multiple teams probably, in fact. Instead, a CNAPP says, hey, that machine, we know it's open to the internet. We also know that vulnerability now is exploitable because it meets all the criteria. And we know it's running in memory, so we know it's easily exploitable. And we know if that machine is exploited, or that workload, I should be more specific, if that workload is exploited, they can assume this privileged role that lives on that workload. That privileged role also has access to this data security, or this bucket that has sensitive data. Now we have a holistic picture of the actual problem where we need to respond to one problem. Now there's still 4 things that need to be fixed, but it is one single problem that we can focus our efforts on. And that's like your best case scenario is that 4 different responses, but one actual problem. But the idea here is we're taking all of our findings and they're cross-correlated together and they're informed by one another to provide a new level of risk we've never been able to have before. So anyway, about halfway through, yes.
Question. Would a CNAPP track all of that in like a graph or network type relationship? And then how would it calculate the risk for me?
Yeah, so without mentioning vendors, yes, there's a novel approach to doing this called graph theory. And you create, I don't know if you know what a graph database is, but basically you can create find complex relationships between assets. And so you can say, well, this cloud workload has a relationship to this S3 bucket by way of a vulnerability or whatever, or an identity in between. That's if you go from this machine, you assume this identity, you go to that bucket. And so it creates this relationship, and it's called a graph table and graph theory. What was the second part of your question? Calculate risk. That's usually data insights is probably the number one way to escalate risk, because if there's some path to sensitive data that immediately gets put up higher. So that's usually the vendor's secret sauce, to be quite honest. Like, how are they prioritizing things? The really good ones, you can usually just trust, like, hey, if it's critical, they're telling you there's a critical problem, it's critical, because they're really good at that. And what they're looking for are combinations of problems that lead to some type of exposure, data exposure, an identity exposure, something like that. But usually data will top all of them, because again, what's the point if someone hacks a machine but can't get anything? Well, that's going to be lower than someone hacks a machine and can get access to sensitive data. So that's usually one that tops most times. Yeah.
When you talk about context, is there a way that CNAPP addresses, let's say, the compliance context, like public sector entity versus banking entity versus?
Yeah, to be quite honest, you'd get that with just the CSPM tool.
Okay.
Because most compliance metrics, and again, as engineers and practitioners, people probably know this, compliance doesn't really care about real problems. They just care about checking the box. And so CSPM can do that really easily because it has full access to your cloud estate, can scan all the configuration, and it can find all the violations according to NIST or FedRAMP or whatever, because FedRAMP is only looking at the static configuration, how things are being set up. So any good CSPM provider technically can get to that. But that doesn't really help. And that's why compliance frameworks broadly in the industry are kind of seen as a necessary evil. Like, well, we got to do it because our status as a company requires this. But I mean, I've worked for companies that had several compliance metrics and their security was awful. Because when you look at the whole cloud estate, the whole identity estate, and all that, you see, well, I pass, but there's still ways in. So.
You proactively run these type of data sets into like a tool like OneNote Cloud and Ranking?
Yeah, so a lot of the like paid enterprise ones, that's basically what they do. That's basically the kind of graph thing that they're looking for. They're looking for those relationships. So Bloodhound's actually a great kind of yeah. So there's some open source tools. The best open source CSPM is called Prowler. I actually know some enterprise vendors who are just using this on the back end. But Prowler actually will just spit out their predefined list of cloud checks that they're looking for, and yeah, you can, it just spits it out of the database or the table. It's kind of up to you to build that relationship, and that's what's really hard. And that's what not a lot of vendors are doing. In fact, there's only one really right now that's doing it well. There's others that are trying to replicate that, and so that's the hard part. So there's not really anything open source out there in the community. You just kind of have to build it yourself. Like a Neo, Neo database and build it by yourself. I wouldn't recommend it. It's very hard. Yeah. So the whole point of CNAPP, again, take all these findings, bring them together, understand what's our actual problems, not just things that are violating a bunch of policies. I talked about some other SPM, so ASPM, this is a big one. Also, like data security posture management, which tells us about exposure risk, ASPM can be a really great insight to understand, like, hey, we know it's actually running in memory, so now we can tell our developers, fix this problem first, and we eliminate the underlying problem. And so the ASPM tools are really helpful, helping us analyze our code, understanding like where did this problem come from the actual like executed code. SaaS security posture management, this is more looking at like the configuration of the tool itself, like SharePoint, Box, and all that kind of stuff. Good insights to have that can help enrich your findings. AI SPM, this is a really new one. I hate the term, but it's a necessary term. Understanding what's the posture of our AI data sets, how are they being trained, what do the data sets have access to, do they have access to sensitive data, that kind of stuff. Are people running unapproved AI workloads in our cloud environment? Maybe everything has to run through a particular vendor or a particular gateway or something like that. Kubernetes security posture management, also big. Much like CSPM, KSPM is looking at the configuration of the cluster itself, not just the workload running in it. That's CWPP. But we want to look at, well, how is the Kubernetes, because Kubernetes, by the way, is just a big API, just an API. And so we want to look at how's that API configured? Is it configured with best practices, that kind of stuff. So those are the other posture management tools that you might find helpful. It just depends on your business and like what's important to you. And I'll go through an example of what that means. But everyone says they have a CNAPP. Like I said, this doesn't really sound unique. This doesn't really sound new. Everyone says they have one. And so how do you, again, spot the BS? How do you find out what's really important, and how do you evaluate these vendors in your business? There's three things I like to talk about. I'll explain each of these. Number one, vendors, they see CNAPP as a new product, not as a process. That's a big one. I'll explain that here in a second. A wider net does equal wider protection sometimes. I'll explain the nuances there. And then novelty versus efficacy. So first, product over process. When a company says like, hey, we have CSPM, hey, we have DSPM, let's say they have all four of the things that I say are absolutely critical. Yeah, we got it. We're good. But they're not all correlated together. This means my response is like I gave before with the exposed machine to the internet, or exposed workload to the internet, vulnerability running in runtime that's exploitable with an identity that allows them to pivot to sensitive data, right? Okay, 4 different responses, 4 different teams, and no context of which one's most important. Which one actually stops the holistic problem? Well, actually, we don't know the holistic problem because these findings aren't correlated. And so the goal is to say, hey, instead of having 4 different responses from 4 different teams potentially that have varying levels of workload and capabilities, instead make it a process. Our process is to take all of these insights, correlate them, do everything I've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, and say, here's your actual problem. Here's your response. Again, that response might still be 4 changes to your cloud environment. That's okay. But we are going after one problem, one effort to fix this one problem. And again, that may be multiple steps in the changes. Or it could just be like, hey, take out this publicly exposure part, the dominoes can no longer fall. Or, you know, the Jenga, if you pull this one part out, the whole thing falls apart. And so that's what we want to do. And so we're going to highlight the most critical problem first to eliminate the overall problem, and then we can come back later and clean up all the other stuff that on their own, they're just mediums, lows, criticalities, that kind of stuff. So that's what I mean by they treat it like it's just a product. Well, no, treat it like a process. You got to process all of these findings together and make it part of, you know, like your ethos as a company is we're going to take all these insights. And there's some vendors I'm happy to talk with you guys after that I think don't do this well. They treat all of it, and they do it by acquisition, or they do it by we're just going to build a new part of our tool, and they don't bother to say, okay, we built that part of the tool, we get all the findings, now let's go analyze all the other findings together, cross-correlate, blah, blah, blah. Second, a wider net equals better. So let's go with the fishing idea. If you have a wider net, or excuse me, you have a net, you got your CSPM, great, and I want to add more capabilities. So I, you know, buy or develop my, you know, identity security posture manager, and that's another net off the other side of the boat. And then I need to keep up with the times, data security posture. And then cloud workload, I have 4 different nets I'm pulling on now. So when I have a problem in one, it's not, you know, problems in another aren't influencing it. And I got to pull 4 different ways. Again, going back to that example. Instead of more nets, I want a wider net. So that all of my efforts are in one direction, I pull everything all out at once. I go after the problem holistically. So we do want wider coverage, but we want it the right way. Not just, hey, we're going to buy a company that does CSPM. Hey, we're going to buy a company that does workload protection and not bothering to integrate it with our platform. And then third, novelty versus efficacy. So if you remember back, I said we were primarily at posture manager runtime, and then they started to cross over. They realized, hey, the modern CNAPP, this is what they're doing. You see vendors, though, go, hey, we got to keep up with the times, and they're going to add these products. They're going to, through acquisition or develop them in-house, use open source tools, add it to their platform. And it starts to go like, hey, we're a CNAPP. And you go, are you really? Like, what are you really good at? And so you take a step back, go to their origin story. Where do they start? And that's usually what they still do. Everything else is just kind of, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They truly do want it to be a good part of their product. It's not like they're going to half bake it and intentionally make it bad. They're trying to make it good. And so they go, a Kubernetes security vendor, hey, we've got to keep up with the times. We've got to have insights by CSPM. Our CSPM is going to provide great insights to our workload protection to help prioritize what actually needs fixed. And so they build that out, and they integrate it well. Let's say they go all the way, and it's great. But that is not their focus. Their focus is still cloud workload protection. You can kind of tell with certain companies, like what's their focus. What did they build as like a necessary evil to make their product better, and what did they build as a part of their product and who they want to be, who they fundamentally want to be. That will really tell you when you're selecting and trying to evaluate products, who's going to be a good partner long term, because they're making this who they are, not just adding a capability to their line card. On the flip side, if it's a CSPM vendor, that's where they started, and they go, we got to keep up with the times, we got to add in an agent. And they do that to provide valuable insights. Well, you can kind of tell it's, again, give them the benefit of the doubt, they really put their effort into it, but it's not who they are as a business. It's not what they say they do. Then you're going to spot, like, you know, maybe their innovation on the workload protection isn't going to be as fast as a vendor who that's what they do. That's what they say they do. And so that's their novel approach to securing your cloud environment versus they're trying to be the most effective platform for everyone. That's their novelty, and that's what they're going for, and you can kind of spot some of that. That's fine. I do want to close with some resources. So number one, James Berthotti, Tech, that's his company. He just started recently, Latio.tech. He's got a lot of great resources. He and actually Francis Odom, while I was making this presentation, they released an article, a joint article together, talking about CNAPP in the future and the enterprise. And a lot of what he had to say is in this presentation. So I felt very good that like, hey, this is where other people in the industry are moving as well. So James Berthotti, Francis Odom, he's an instructor from Maven. He's a a cybersecurity analyst by trade. Two great people to follow. Great resources. They're very well spoken, very well connected, so they can give you a lot of resources. Both active on LinkedIn too. Okay, so we got 10 minutes left. I thankfully am right at the end of my presentation. Really appreciate the time to talk, and I do want to be open for questions. And again, my point is to not talk vendors, but if you have questions about vendors, I'd love to. Yeah.
So when you were talking about looking at where the companies came from and where they are now, so you're talking about what their core competencies would be as an organization. So like if they come from an EDR or AV background, they're most likely going to have workload protection probably more as compared to maybe like somebody who's traditionally an identity provider would have the whatever that thing is. It's not a scene.
Yeah, identity security posture. I'll give you a great example. Again, I'll break my rule. CrowdStrike. EDR, they kind of push into CWPP, at least they say they do. They're doing a legacy way of doing it with like containers and Kubernetes. They actually have a great identity security platform, identity governance. It's really good. CSPM, not so much. Now, if you're a CrowdStrike customer and you use their identity stuff, their cloud insights will actually probably be pretty valuable. But you can, if you're trying to buy a CSPM tool, one that's really strong in there, let's say like compliance is our lifeblood. We've got to be good at compliance in order to stay alive. Well, buying someone who's not CSPM centric or focused, probably not going to be the best long-term play. You may have to have CrowdStrike over here, another vendor over there to do that. You have a question?
Yeah, can you give any advice on how to, what to include to make a business use case for investment away from disparate solutions?
That's a great question. Normally, I'm talking to like CISOs who have the budget, and I'm trying to appeal to their way of thinking, which is time to value. So how quickly can we reduce the most critical problems? Again, every tool is going to tell you what's critical, but a proper CNAPP hopefully giving you the best insight to what's critical.
Tools have different security posture models too, so depends on if you're using like DLP
So yeah, time to value. Where I was going. But yeah, I'm trying to speak their language. I'm trying to help them understand. Oh, I was talking about risk prioritization. So if you're getting a good risk prioritization, that's really going to help you understand where the most critical risks are. Focus our teams on that. Again, usually CISOs, people who have the budget, we're talking compliance because it's an important thing to them. We've got to have that. And so we're speaking to that. But we're also looking at like, hey, I don't want to just talk to you about a product that you will use or your cloud security team will use. I want to talk to you about a product that the term we like to use is democratize the product. So a big selling point and a value prop that we help is saying like, hey, you're going to buy this, and let's say you have budget for it. But it's going to be so good at helping people understand what risks really are. Your DevOps are going to want in on it. Your vulnerability management team is going to want in on it. Your SOC team is going to get value from it. I mean, there's dedicated, usually portals or platforms or dashboards, in these that are tailored to these different teams to say like, hey, you're a SOC analyst. This will probably be most useful to you, the cloud detection and response, that kind of stuff. And so the democratization of a platform is really going to be another selling point because that's really what they want to know. Is this going to be a tool I have to force people to use? Or is it going to be a tool that's actually going to be helpful to the organization that they're actually going to want to use and they're going to be asking for? So that's a good way to build value prop. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you recommend to like involve DevOps and developers and different teams
Yeah.
with the product selection?
Yeah, so we call it a shared responsibility model and a consumption strategy. So shared responsibility is who is going to be responsible for the findings within the platform. And again, because we want to democratize this, they're going to have some responsibility. Your DevOps, vulnerability, your server team, because they're deploying Windows servers or whatever, or Linux servers. So yes, part of a POV, POC and evaluating is getting these people in on it. And then, so we have the democratization, shared responsibility, and the consumption strategy. Now with the actual findings, how do we consume that? What integrations do we make? So that's another thing to look at. Do you have a healthy ecosystem integrations with EDR tools, with SOAR and SIM integrations and things like that? Yeah, I do think it's helpful to have them in on it, on the POV or POC, or at least evaluating, because they should have a hand in it instead of you buy the product and then force it on those teams, because that's never going to go well. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to you in a second.
So I understand that they call it cloud workload protection, but I feel like in modern enterprise that's not necessarily where it would live only, because so like if you're running VMware stacks, containers,
Yeah.
containers on premise, or you're doing these other things, is this something that would also be used even in maybe a private cloud or
Yes.
data center for that?
That's a great question. I think that's why I had that definition of cloud native is it's a data center and you're using their offerings, because then that technically applies to ESXi, Nutanix, all that stuff. You're using the offering provided by that platform. Who cares that it's not a public cloud? I'm using ESXi. So for example, cloud workload protection, that's a great one. That's usually the agent. That can absolutely be installed on our Linux machines, on our Kubernetes clusters, hosted on-prem. I believe that is part of cloud native. Because cloud native, again, it's why I like to define it. You're using the offerings provided by whatever data center you're using. CSP, ESXi on-prem, what have you. You had a question over here. I thought I saw a hand up. My bad. Okay. Anybody else? What, 5 minutes? Yeah.
The gentleman's question in the center about how to get executive buy-in, something that worked for us this year that wouldn't have worked any other year without naming vendors. There was one that had global PR happen. That vendor was an existing partner of ours and is massively discounting their services in response to this event. So my suggestion might be if you have a partner that exists and they have security issues, but you still have faith in them, that is the moment you can leverage this guy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Strike while the iron's hot.
Yeah.
See what you get out of it. But we did see some of that. That was also a chance. Again, we're a vendor agnostic reseller. We sell a lot of different platforms, and we consult and provide services for a lot of different platforms. That was a huge opportunity for us to say, like, hey, were you already not happy with that vendor? Was there something maybe you didn't like? Maybe their price was too expensive. And that was a great way for us to say, like, hey, we'd like to introduce you to this other option. So yeah, we definitely capitalized on that. So that's a great point. But yeah, do the same thing with CNAPP. With your providers, constantly be evaluating. This space is changing so rapidly. The future of CNAPP is going to be CDR, detection and response. Because again, for years we've had tools tell us what's wrong. Now we need help doing it. And with the introduction of generative AI and all of these agents to help, now we can actually automate a lot of this stuff. I'm going to break my rule again, sorry. Tynes, Torque, all these really great companies that have free offerings that companies can use to help automate our response in the SOC, automate our cloud fixes and changes. Hugely important. So leverage them. Any other questions? I'll take one more if you got it. No? All right, well, thank you all. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks all for coming. Thank you, Kenny. Thank you for speaking. Really appreciate it. If you haven't already, go to the front desk, go to registration, check in. We got to get up everyone's numbers, so we got enough food, we got enough everything. The 11:30 talk on track 3 has changed. Brendan Crow is going to be talking about threat modeling and secure architecture design.
Hey, what's up? Good, man. How are you? Good, how are you?